On the night of March 8, 2014, while most of the world slept, one of the most advanced global military surveillance networks in human history was fully awake, silently scanning skies, seas, and borders across Southeast Asia. When Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 vanished from civilian radar, the public was told that the aircraft simply disappeared into the darkness, lost somewhere over the vast Indian Ocean, leaving behind only questions and grief. But what was rarely discussed in the early days was a critical reality. This region of the world is among the most heavily monitored airspaces on Earth, saturated with overlapping military radar systems, naval detection grids, satellite intelligence, and signals interception platforms operated not by one country, but by many. Civilian radar may have lost MH370, but military surveillance does not operate under the same limitations. And that fact alone changes everything about how we understand this mystery. From the moment flight MH370 deviated from its planned route, turning sharply westward over the Malay Peninsula, it entered airspace watched closely by multiple defense forces due to long-standing geopolitical tensions, strategic shipping lanes, and national security priorities. The official narrative initially emphasized confusion and technical uncertainty, yet behind the scenes, military operators were tracking something unusual, a large commercial aircraft flying at odd altitudes, changing speeds, and navigating with apparent precision through controlled and contested zones, without issuing distress signals or radio calls. Malaysian military radar later acknowledged detecting an unidentified aircraft consistent with MH370's size and speed crossing back over the peninsula and heading into the Andaman Sea. But this admission came days later, raising an immediate and troubling question. If the military saw it, why wasn't the world told immediately? The answer lies in the culture of military secrecy, where radar capabilities, detection ranges, and response protocols are considered classified assets, not public information, even during a civilian disaster. Revealing exactly what was seen, when it was seen, and how clearly it was tracked would have exposed the strengths and weaknesses of national defense systems to adversaries watching closely. This meant that from the very beginning, the search for MH370 was constrained not by a lack of data, but by how much of that data governments were willing to admit existed at all. As MH370 continued its westward flight path, it moved through zones monitored not just by Malaysia, but by neighboring states, whose militaries routinely share intelligence through quiet, informal channels while denying such cooperation publicly. Thailand, Indonesia, India, and even distant partners with satellite surveillance capabilities all had potential visibility of the aircraft's abnormal journey. Military primary radar, unlike civilian secondary radar, does not require transponder signals. It detects raw objects, metal masses moving through airspace, regardless of whether they want to be seen or not. This distinction is critical because it means that even after MH370's transponder was disabled, the aircraft did not become invisible, only officially unacknowledged. What makes this even more unsettling is that no interception was launched, no emergency alert was issued, and no public warning was made while a large, unidentified aircraft crossed sovereign airspace in ways that normally would have triggered immediate defensive responses. The silence suggests either a deliberate decision not to act, or a failure so profound that it challenges assumptions about modern air defense. Military surveillance systems are designed to prevent surprise, yet MH370 appears to have slipped through not because it could not be seen, but because seeing it created complications no government wanted to confront in real time. In the days that followed, carefully worded statements replaced transparency, with officials emphasizing uncertainty while quietly coordinating behind closed doors. Radar data was selectively released, flight paths were redrawn, and timelines shifted, creating confusion that persists more than a decade later. This is why MH370 is not just an aviation mystery. It is a military intelligence mystery, one that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what governments know, what they choose to reveal, and how much truth can be withheld in the name of national security. In this first part of our series, we begin peeling back the layers of silence surrounding military surveillance on the night MH370 vanished, setting the stage for deeper revelations ahead. Because to understand where the aircraft went, we must first understand who was watching, and why they may not want us to know exactly what they saw. By the time the world learned that Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 had vanished, military surveillance systems across the region had already completed what they are designed to do best: detect, track, classify, and log an airborne object moving through sensitive airspace. And this is where the story becomes far more unsettling than the official timeline suggests. Unlike civilian air traffic control, which depends heavily on transponders voluntarily broadcasting an aircraft's identity and position, military primary radar systems operate independently, emitting powerful radio waves that bounce off physical objects and return precise data about altitude, speed, direction, and size. These systems exist specifically to detect aircraft that do not want to be seen, including hostile military jets, bombers, and intruding surveillance planes, which means a large Boeing 777, like MH370, would have been one of the easiest targets imaginable. Southeast Asia is covered by layered radar architecture, with overlapping ranges designed to eliminate blind spots, particularly over the Malacca Strait and Andaman Sea, two of the most strategically critical maritime corridors on Earth. On the night MH370 deviated from its flight path, it crossed areas monitored by Malaysian air defense radar, Thai surveillance installations, and Indian long-range coastal radar systems, all of which were fully operational due to regional security protocols. Malaysian authorities later confirmed that their military radar tracked an unidentified aircraft making a sharp turn westward, climbing and descending erratically, behavior inconsistent with a lost or malfunctioning airliner and far more suggestive of deliberate manual control. Yet even with this confirmation, the most critical question remained unanswered: why was no interceptor aircraft scrambled? In standard military doctrine, an unidentified aircraft deviating from known flight paths, refusing communication, and crossing sovereign airspace would normally trigger an immediate response, including fighter jet interception, visual identification, and forced communication attempts. The absence of such action implies that decision-makers either believed they knew what the aircraft was, were instructed not to respond, or feared the consequences of acting incorrectly in a politically sensitive environment. Adding another layer of complexity is the role of military satellites, which silently observe Earth around the clock, collecting radar, infrared, and electronic intelligence data. While no government has officially acknowledged satellite imagery of MH370 during its final hours, it is almost certain that at least some overhead assets detected anomalies, especially if the aircraft changed altitude rapidly or flew at cruising levels inconsistent with commercial flight profiles. Infrared sensors designed to detect missile launches and high-heat signatures would have noticed an aircraft of MH370's size if it experienced unusual engine behavior or sudden maneuvers, yet no such data has ever been released. This silence fuels speculation not because it proves conspiracy, but because it contradicts what modern surveillance networks are known to capture every single day. Even more troubling is the coordination, or lack thereof, between neighboring militaries during the event. Intelligence sharing agreements exist precisely to handle ambiguous airborne threats, yet public statements from regional governments were fragmented, delayed, and often contradictory, suggesting that information was being filtered, compartmentalized, or intentionally minimized. Some officials later claimed radar data was inconclusive, while others admitted it existed but could not be shared due to national security restrictions, a justification that protected military capabilities but left families and investigators in the dark. This selective disclosure created a distorted search effort, sending resources in the wrong direction during the critical early days when fuel exhaustion timelines and drift models mattered most. If military radar data showing MH370's westward flight had been fully disclosed immediately, the entire search strategy might have changed, potentially narrowing the area dramatically. Instead, the world was left chasing incomplete signals while the most reliable tracking systems remained classified. What emerges from this is not a picture of total ignorance, but of controlled awareness, systems that saw, analysts who understood, and decisions that prioritized secrecy over clarity. As we move forward in this series, it becomes increasingly clear that MH370 did not vanish into a blind spot of technology, but into a gray zone of responsibility, where knowing too much carried risks that governments were unwilling to take. In the next part, we will examine how signals intelligence, electronic warfare capabilities, and intercepted communications may hold the missing pieces to understanding what happened during the final hours of this flight, and why those signals may still be buried deep within classified archives. As military radar quietly tracked the physical movement of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370, another invisible battle was unfolding in parallel, one fought not with aircraft or missiles, but with signals, frequencies, and streams of digital data that modern militaries harvest continuously from the airspace around them. Signals intelligence, often referred to as SIGINT, is designed to capture and analyze electronic emissions, including radio transmissions, satellite handshakes, navigation pings, and even unintended electronic leaks from onboard systems. And on the night MH370 disappeared, the aircraft was still very much alive electronically long after it vanished from civilian radar. Even after the transponder was switched off, MH370 continued communicating silently with satellites through its onboard systems, most notably through automated handshakes that occurred roughly every hour, confirming that the aircraft was powered, airborne, and following a sustained flight path. These signals were not distress calls and did not reveal precise location data, but they were unmistakable proof that the aircraft was under control and flying deliberately for several hours after initial contact was lost. What is far less discussed is that these satellite communications were not private, nor were they beyond the reach of military intelligence agencies that routinely monitor global satellite traffic for strategic awareness. Nations with advanced SIGINT capabilities continuously intercept satellite uplinks and downlinks, not necessarily to read their content, but to log timing, frequency, power levels, and movement patterns, which can reveal an aircraft's behavior with surprising accuracy. In a region dense with military listening posts, naval surveillance ships, and allied intelligence sharing agreements, it is highly improbable that MH370's electronic presence went unnoticed. Beyond satellite handshakes, the aircraft's navigation systems, flight management computers, and radio altimeters all emitted electronic signatures that could be detected by sophisticated monitoring platforms, especially if the aircraft altered altitude or course multiple times, as military radar later suggested. The absence of any released SIGINT data does not indicate that none exists. Rather, it highlights how deeply classified such material is, because revealing interception capabilities would expose how governments listen, what they can hear, and how precisely they can reconstruct events after the fact. Even more intriguing is the possibility that MH370 passed through zones monitored by electronic warfare assets designed to detect anomalies, unidentified aircraft, or potential threats to naval forces. These systems are capable of flagging unusual signal behavior, such as sudden equipment shutdowns, inconsistent navigation updates, or deviations from expected commercial flight profiles. If such anomalies were logged, they would have been reviewed not by civilian accident investigators, but by military analysts trained to assess intent, threat level, and strategic implications. This raises a deeply unsettling possibility that MH370 was not treated purely as a missing airliner in its final hours, but as an unidentified aircraft of interest, monitored quietly while authorities waited to see what it would do next. The lack of interception, combined with continued electronic activity, suggests a scenario in which decision-makers believed the aircraft posed no immediate threat, or that intervening carried greater risks than allowing it to continue. When MH370 finally stopped communicating with satellites, it did so without sending a distress signal, emergency beacon, or mayday call, a silence that speaks volumes about the state of the cockpit and the intentions or incapacitation of those inside. That final electronic goodbye marked the moment the aircraft truly vanished, not because technology failed, but because its signals ended beyond the reach of open disclosure. What remains locked away in classified archives are the electronic breadcrumbs that could clarify whether MH370's final flight was guided, compromised, or simply allowed to unfold without interference. As we move into the next part of this series, we will examine how geopolitical sensitivity, international intelligence alliances, and fear of exposing military capabilities may have shaped the public narrative, and why the truth about MH370 may be less about what happened in the sky, and more about what governments decided not to say afterward. By the time it became undeniable that Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 had not crashed where the world was initially told to look, the mystery had already crossed out of the realm of aviation safety and into the far more sensitive domain of geopolitics, where truth is often treated as a negotiable asset rather than an obligation. Southeast Asia sits at the crossroads of competing military interests, intelligence alliances, and strategic rivalries, and the night MH370 vanished, those invisible tensions shaped how information was shared, withheld, and ultimately framed for the public. Military surveillance data does not exist in isolation. It is embedded within national defense systems designed to deter adversaries, protect borders, and signal strength without revealing vulnerabilities. Admitting exactly how MH370 was tracked, for how long, and by whom would have exposed radar coverage gaps, reaction times, command hierarchies, and decision-making protocols that foreign powers would analyze relentlessly. For some nations, acknowledging that they tracked a large unidentified aircraft without responding would suggest hesitation or weakness. For others, revealing that they could track it in detail would advertise surveillance capabilities they preferred to keep hidden. This created a shared incentive across borders to downplay certainty and emphasize ambiguity, even as internal intelligence assessments may have been far more confident about the aircraft's general trajectory. Intelligence sharing agreements further complicated the situation, because once data is pooled among allies, it becomes collectively owned and collectively restricted, meaning no single government can unilaterally release information without diplomatic consequences. In this environment, transparency becomes a casualty of consensus, and the official narrative shifts toward what can be said safely rather than what is known accurately. The families of those on board were left waiting not because answers were unavailable, but because releasing them would have required governments to admit uncomfortable truths, that the aircraft was monitored, that opportunities to intervene existed, and that decisions were made in real time to observe rather than act. This silence also protected institutions from accountability, because once the mystery is framed as unknowable, no one can be blamed for failing to stop it. Over time, this strategic quiet hardened into policy, reinforced by legal concerns, diplomatic pressure, and the simple passage of years, which gradually dulled public outrage. Each delayed disclosure reduced the likelihood that full intelligence records would ever be released. As memories faded, personnel changed, and classified material became buried deeper within bureaucratic systems designed to outlast individual careers. What emerges from this is not a single villain or conspiracy, but a convergence of interests where silence benefited everyone except those seeking closure. MH370 became a lesson in how modern surveillance does not guarantee modern accountability, and how the same systems that promise safety can also enable plausible deniability on a global scale. As the search moved farther from the moment of disappearance, the truth became less about locating wreckage and more about navigating political realities, where reopening the past carried risks no government was eager to take. In the final part of this series, we will confront the ultimate question that lingers beneath all others: whether the full story of MH370 can ever be told, and what it would take for the classified walls surrounding this case to finally come down. More than a decade after Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 vanished from the sky, the mystery no longer feels like a question of technology, search zones, or ocean depth, but a test of whether modern power structures are willing to confront their own silence. The world has been told repeatedly that everything that could be shared has been shared, yet the existence of advanced military surveillance, satellite intelligence, radar tracking, and signals interception tells a different story, one where data almost certainly exists but remains locked behind classifications designed to protect nations rather than people. MH370 did not disappear in a technological dark age. It vanished in an era of unprecedented monitoring, where skies are watched continuously and anomalies are flagged instantly. That contradiction is why this case refuses to rest. The unanswered questions persist not because answers are impossible, but because releasing them would force governments to explain why a clearly tracked aircraft was allowed to continue unchecked, why early search efforts were misdirected, and why transparency was sacrificed in favor of strategic caution. Over time, secrecy becomes self-sustaining. Once information is withheld long enough, revealing it risks reputational damage, legal consequences, and public outrage that grows with every passing year. For intelligence agencies, the calculation is brutally pragmatic. Admitting what was known may bring no benefit, only accountability. Yet for the families of the passengers and crew, and for a world that trusts aviation systems with millions of lives every day, that silence represents something far more damaging: the erosion of trust in the idea that safety comes before secrecy. MH370 stands as a symbol of how even in an age of total surveillance, truth can still vanish if enough powerful institutions agree to look away. The aircraft's final resting place may one day be found by new technology, private exploration, or sheer persistence. But wreckage alone will not answer the deeper questions that define this mystery. What truly happened in the hours after the aircraft turned westward? Who tracked it? Who decided not to intervene? And who chose what the world would be told may remain hidden unless political will shifts dramatically? History shows that classified truths do sometimes emerge, not because institutions volunteer them, but because pressure becomes impossible to ignore. Until that day comes, MH370 remains suspended between what is known and what is acknowledged, a reminder that the most advanced surveillance systems on Earth can see almost everything, except, sometimes, the courage to tell the full story. And perhaps that is the most unsettling legacy of all.